Okay, good afternoon, folks. My name is Justin Carter. I'm a project associate with the Center for Rural Affairs, and welcome to our next installment of the webinar series, Cooperatives, Building a Base for the Future. Today, we'll be hearing from Kevin Edberg. Kevin is the Executive Director of Cooperative Development Services. He's coming to us out of Minnesota, and he's going to be telling us a little bit about worker cooperatives today. So if you're not familiar with the Center for Rural Affairs, we are a small nonprofit out of Lyons, Nebraska. We do a broad base of work in rural communities related to small businesses, policies, and grassroots food and farm work. And we are in the midst of a project on cooperative education, and we're really looking forward to hearing from Kevin. And I will go ahead and turn it over to him right now.
Thank you very much, Justin. I am the Executive Director of Cooperative Development Services. We are a 37-year-old nonprofit organization created by the cooperative community of the Upper Midwest to help people start and grow cooperative businesses in multiple sectors of the economy. We primarily work these days in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa. We have experience in agriculture, in bioenergy, in senior housing, grocery co-ops, and a variety of others. So we've done work in multiple sectors. The worker co-op sector is a relatively recent addition to our portfolio and reflects a growing interest nationally in looking at how ownership and employment can be used to solidify economic futures, can be used to build wealth, can create greater control over one's future. And so we'll discuss some of that today. Certainly we will not be comprehensive in covering every aspect of worker co-op formation, but there are some resources that I'll share at the end, and we'll go from there. So with that, why don't we move to the next slide? So what I'm going to try and do today is just talk generally about worker-owned co-ops, why they are growing in interest, some of the things that we are seeing in the process of how to start worker-owned co-ops, talk a little bit about resources, and then have some Q&A at the end. Next slide, please. So, as I suspect your followers and viewers of previous cooperative sessions have learned, a cooperative is a business that's owned and controlled by the people who use its services. In this regard, the ownership of the cooperative, the owners have the power in the organization and the authority to delegate responsibility. And so member owners delegate responsibility through a democratic election of their board of directors. That board then typically operates or governs the operation of the business by setting policy, selecting and supervising management. And they in turn delegate a portion of accountability and control to management, who's responsible then for carrying out policies, hiring and supervising the work of the organization, whether that be through employees, contractors, whatever. Staff or contractors implement various work of the organization to all with the purpose of achieving some ends, some outcomes that the owner members have said, this is what we want. These are the changes we want in the world. And so we form the cooperative, we elect from our members management to a board of directors to oversee management to deliver those goodies. And that's how this cycle of accountability and delegation kind of works. Next slide, please. So in the context of a worker-owned cooperative, it is the employees, the workers, who own the business. They democratically control the business by making decisions, typically on a one-member, one-vote basis. And in that process, typically there is a compensation schedule that's used on a regular basis for compensating the regular work of employees And then at the end of the year, if there is surplus generated, the board makes decisions about what portion of that surplus is required to remain within the cooperative for funding future initiatives, ensuring the cooperative's longevity and sustainability. And any additional surplus is returned to the owner members based on patronage, typically some mechanism, some formula based on their labor contribution to the cooperative. So that's kind of how this cooperative context plays out in a worker-owned cooperative. Next slide, please. In the world, the largest worker-owned cooperative is Mondragon, a very well-known and often studied business that took root in the Basque region of Spain. It has become quite well storied. It is the 7th largest business in Spain, includes both manufacturing as well as retail cooperatives within the Mondragon family, as well as their own bank for financing their work and the financial well-being of their various employee owner members. Certainly a very good example to look at how study and vision 70 years ago shaped a culture that said, these are the needs of our people in this time and place. We do not have access to the resources we think we need for having viable communities. We're going to take this on ourselves. They organized a worker-owned cooperative and has since spread to multiple businesses on several continents. In the United States, our largest worker-owned cooperative is Cooperative Home Care Associates. It's located in New York City, the Bronx. It has 2,300 employees, of which about 1,100 are worker owners. So that kind of puts a bookend on one size of enterprise. In total, in the United States, we think we have something about 500 worker co-ops in the US, representing the ownership of about 7,000 workers and $550 million in revenues. So that gets some aspect of scale to where the worker ownership sector is in the US today. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, the worker-owned sector has been growing significantly in recent years. Certainly much more attention being paid to it as we look at an economy where not all people are able to participate in an equitable fashion. Certainly not all communities having access to external support and external resource, and looking at worker ownership as a mechanism for satisfying local needs and keeping dollars moving, circulating in local economies. So the attention and growth of worker-owned cooperatives has really been picking up nationwide over the past decade. There are multiple regions in the United States that have organizations, cooperative development organizations that are championing this model in their communities. Some of the reasons that we find and that we consistently hear from communities for why they are interested in worker ownership is a sense of taking control of their own economic futures. Clearly, in the traditional capitalist model that we kind of like are fish swimming in an ocean of relatively unbridled capitalism, money moves and resources are under the control. We have far more concentration of employment within the corporate structure, relatively large corporations owned and controlled by relatively few individuals, and generally on a one share, one vote basis. Those who control those entities make decisions that are in their financial best interest, but they do not necessarily represent the interests of other stakeholders, such as employees or the communities in which they operate. And so there has been a distinct aspect of wanting to reclaim control over key functions of local economies, and worker ownership is one way of anchoring those businesses in communities. A second one is building wealth. In the United States, small business ownership has historically been a significant way of families building wealth, starting and growing small business. And as those businesses grow and prosper, wealth is accumulated, procuring support for families, and then handed down to potentially to next generations. But this idea is that small business ownership has been a pathway, and employee ownership in that way creates the same opportunity for a broader base of ownership. We are in a period of time where baby boomers are a disproportionate portion of the ownership of small business in the United States. That's mostly a byproduct of just plain demographics, but those baby boomers are aging out. And in many cases, they've not necessarily done a great job of planning for business succession. In the United States, we sometimes think that most families just keep the business and hand it down from generation to generation to generation. That happens to some extent, to a lesser extent today than in previous generations. And often, one of the things that I hear, particularly in rural communities, is that when a small business is still viable and up for sale, the owners may lack opportunities for who to sell it to. The people who might be interested in purchasing their business might be a competitor who's interested in some intellectual property or a customer list or a certain product line. They may or may not be interested in the plant facility and the employees themselves. And so when sales do occur, they don't necessarily end well for the folks who have built that small business in the communities where they reside. And so this idea of how can we use worker ownership as a tool for anchoring the next generation of ownership in a community and retaining the direct effects of employment and opportunity, but then also the indirect effects on supply chains and other business networks that are created and sustained by that enterprise. Those all contribute to economic vitality in rural communities. And so as these baby boomers are aging out, we see businesses coming up for sale, and some proportion of them might be quite appropriate for worker ownership. So we see that as a trend. We also particularly appreciate about the co-op model that it is particularly flexible and accessible for relatively small businesses. That businesses in general with under 100, probably particularly under 50 employees, can be particularly good candidates for considering worker ownership. There may be other forms of employee ownership that are appropriate for larger businesses. We'll talk about that in a moment. But this idea that cooperatives are relatively flexible, straightforward, relatively easy to form from a business formation standpoint, makes this an opportunity worth being aware of, and I believe it has particular value to rural communities. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there are other forms of employee ownership that can also be pursued. The most dominant one is the employee stock ownership plan, or the ESOP. This tool was created probably 30, 40 years ago. It's been used by thousands of businesses. There are thousands of ESOPs. Excuse me. The ESOP functions as and exists in law as a pension program or as a part of a retirement plan. And so it's governed under different, under federal law. And those federal laws require a fair amount of accounting and legal assistance on a regular basis, annual reviews and statement of value, et cetera. And those functions drive up the cost of maintaining the ESOP. If you are a large organization with lots of participants in the ESOP, the cost per participant can be quite affordable. And so the ESOP is better suited because of its scale to work with larger employee, with businesses with larger employee bases. But it's that cost of administration and regulatory compliance that drive up the cost of an ESOP, and that is not present in a cooperative. So that provides a little bit of an insight into why co-ops might be better for smaller organization. Though, as I noted, Home Care Associates has got 2,300 employees, so it's not exactly tiny, and cooperatives can function at that scale as well. We also, there's a relatively new, or at least new to the US, structure called an employee ownership trust. We have seen that at work in Europe, particularly in the UK. We're seeing more of it getting some grounding in the United States. It's not something that I'm particularly familiar with, but it is an existing form, and folks can go read about that on the website for the Minnesota Center for Employee Ownership. Next slide, please. So when we talk about forming any kind of cooperative, there are certain ground rules that will apply, and not surprisingly, they apply to most kinds of businesses that one might form. If you're going to form a business, you need to have an entrepreneurial spirit. That is, you need to have a sense that we are going to take risk. We are going to try to serve a market need. We will bring talent and energy in the form of capital, in the form of management, in the form of customer satisfaction in some manner to serve that market need. What is somewhat different in cooperative entrepreneurship is this unique sharing of roles, that when you are the owner of the company and the user of the company, remember, a cooperative is an enterprise owned and controlled by the people who use its services. When you are trying to serve the owners, it makes no sense for the business to try and extract excess income or take advantage of their customers, because their customers are the owners. It just doesn't make any sense to do that. So the business operates from a different premise of what kind of good the organization is supposed to produce. And that's this unique role of owners as users that conveys that, that distinction. The cooperative model does have some unique attributes of governance, finance, and tax treatment. It's why we look for allied professionals with particular experience in cooperative enterprise. So we actually, there are whole subsets in the legal profession, in the accounting profession, people who specialize in the laws and rules of cooperatives that become particularly useful, and why people who are thinking about forming cooperatives should prefer to work with those professionals who are competent in that trade. It's a recognized specialty or subset within those professions. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the other key attributes of cooperative ownership is this idea that net surplus, after the entity has determined what its financial needs are to provide the ongoing sustainability of the co-op, excess additional surplus, what we might call profit in another structured enterprise, is distributed back to the owner members based on use. That's distributed back to the patrons of the business based on the extent to which the patrons utilize the business. Co-op world, we call that patronage. And so the fact that it's proportional, it encourages people to use the business of which they are an owner. And a corollary to that is that in a cooperative enterprise, the core competitive advantage of a cooperative is the business loyalty of its owner members. That the cooperative does well when it provides for the needs and the outcomes that it was created to serve, and when the owner members use the cooperative to meet those needs. That's a sweet spot in cooperative enterprise. Next one, please. So I've actually observed 3 approaches to worker co-op formation. In some cases, we see brand new startups of worker-owned cooperatives. People coming together saying, we want to form a business. We will be employees of the business. We want the company to be owned by its employees, by us as employees. And so they start up a brand new enterprise to do that. That's not uncommon, but a more common and more dominant approach that's gaining traction these days is a second option, where an existing business is converted to employee ownership, where might be where the retiring owner, maybe a baby boomer, maybe a younger person just wanting to go off and do other things, but the owner enters into a relationship with the employees and sells the business to the employees in some manner. That's the second approach that is really where a lot of the conversation has been happening, just because we have so many of these retirements coming that it's a dominant form. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The last model that I'm seeing is actually people starting up a new cooperative business structure and then going out and buying a business, but not necessarily one that they are currently employees at. In other words, it is a conversion of an existing business to a cooperative that is owned by the people who will work there, but the people who will work there aren't necessarily the people who are working there now. So that's a kind of a variation on a theme, but I've seen examples of all 3 of these processes. I'm mostly going to talk about this second one, this employee conversion conversation. Next slide, please. So in this approach, often the employer, the owner, is the driver of the business and certainly a supporter of this idea of finding a legitimate buyer for their business. They might be motivated by a number of things. It might be a desire for legacy. It might be a desire for rewarding the employees who help build a particular business over time. There can be any number of motivations, but we are finding that in many cases, it's the employer that is initiating the conversation, doing some primary research. That has some implications that I'll talk about in another moment. Having said that, it is not impossible for employees to initiate a buyout conversation where they're saying, hey, we like working for George, but we know that George is getting ready to want to spend time in another place in the winter. And we want to be proactive in addressing our ongoing role in this enterprise. And one way we could exercise that is by buying it from George. So it is not impossible for employees to take a lead in initiating that conversation. As I mentioned, it's this conversion of an existing business to employee ownership that is the most prominent of the 3 approaches that I've seen. And in this and in all other conversions, the availability of technical assistance, that is trained professionals, cooperative developers who know and understand the model, are able to educate around the model, able to answer questions about the ins and outs of what owning and operating in a cooperative context, what that involves, really strongly encouraged. We also find that lenders to these conversions often will strongly encourage, if not require, some type of professional assistance being provided either in the pre-sale or in the post-sale part of the transaction. So in the pre-sale, the lender may ask for third-party assistance in crafting the business plan or in setting up governance structures, things that will assure them that the loan that they're about to make is a reasonable loan. Similarly, after the loan, a post-conversion support process is often strongly encouraged by lenders, mostly as a way of saying, hey, this is a different model. It has some different attributes that help it be successful. We want the new owners to function with support in that model. So it's not uncommon to have post-conversion technical assistance support as a part of these conversations as well. Next slide, please. So there's a kind of a 5-part process that many organizations use many co-op development organizations use in working with conversions, regardless of whether they are initiated by the owner or by the employees. So the first one is simply an educational role where the parties explore, why are we interested in thinking about ownership and what are the potential benefits? Clearly, there is a lot of room to just simply understand the context of the business, and context is critical. So having a phase specifically labeled exploration is a part of that. It may turn out that the co-op approach is not the right approach for a given transition, and that's totally fine. I personally believe that form should follow function, that any transaction, any sale of a business, you should be thinking about what is the appropriate business structure of all of the available options that might meet a need. But certainly, I believe that worker ownership through a cooperative has been underused in our business support, business retention kinds of efforts. And so I certainly want to support folks learning about and knowing about what this model looks like. If you get out of that initial exploration phase and you think, oh, well, this might be something worth spending some time on, then you enter the assessment phase. And the assessment phase is actually where you look at identifying key attributes of the business and start putting some pencils to numbers and doing some hard thinking. You might engage a third-party business valuation expert to get a value on the company. There are several appropriate techniques for establishing business value. Usually owners have one way that they like to think about it. Sometimes the owners put higher values on their companies than others might, but not always. But in any case, this sense of getting an external view of what is the value, the worth of this company. Is this a good business for employees to own? Is it profitable? Is it stable? Does it have good opportunities in the marketplace? And if so, how might that value and that business opportunity be structured in the form of a business transaction? I want to use this for just a moment. I think co-op ownership has sometimes been used as a kind of a thinking of last resort. selling unprofitable businesses to either owners or users in the cooperative model is, in my mind, lemon capitalism. We take our lemons and think that co-ops can make unprofitable companies magically profitable, simply because it's owned by a different set of people. Caution about that. It's like these enterprises need to have sound business fundamentals. The idea of having strategy and using assets to serve a market in a way that yields sustainable economic outcomes is critical, regardless of what that business is. So this assessment phase tries to dig into that question. If at the end of some of that assessment conversation, there is still interest in moving forward, then at that point, you actually go forward and try and structure 3 activities. One is the employees start a process of forming a cooperative. So the entity that will acquire the business is actually legally formed and formed as a cooperative. That's the work done by the employees. The owner and the co-op, or a representative of the co-op, usually it's a steering committee representing the employees, then has a conversation to structure the purchase agreement. What are the terms and conditions under which this enterprise will change hands, and how do we think about that? And usually there is need for external capital to be used to make the initial purchase and to finance that. And so you're structuring the loan deal itself. A norm in this sector is that debt will be repaid by the future profitability of the business. So this is why that assessment in phase 2 is really important. You're going to borrow money to facilitate the transaction, and you're going to repay that loan with income generated through the operation of the business. In most cases, most lenders are going to require the existing owner, the current owner, to participate in financing in some manner. Exactly how that's negotiable, but the sense that the owner retains an interest in the strong functioning of the business post-transaction is a good motivator to make sure that the business is left in viable hands. Once you've structured these ideas and you have the purchase agreement, the nature of the loan, et cetera, all in place, then the 4th phase is you actually execute. That means you incorporate the co-op, execute the purchase agreement, access the loans. And then the last stage is support. And in this one, we talk about that post-conversion support plan that I was mentioning just a few moments ago, providing for access to professionals to work with the new owners as they develop their ownership and governance systems, that they learn about some of the traditions and the norms for how folks can collectively own and govern a shared enterprise. Most of this will be new to most people. We don't find too many folks being serial cooperators in the sense of being owners of multiple cooperatives over time. So for most of us, they will participate in one co-op in their lifetime, at least one worker-owned cooperative in their lifetime. And so it'll be a new experience, and having access to expertise and support is necessary for that. Next slide, please. So when we talk about a conversion, the fact that we are taking an ongoing enterprise and converting it to cooperative ownership, that means that some of our risks are mitigated. We have an existing business. It has customers. It has the means of producing whatever products or services it has. The risks of starting those are mitigated by the fact that the previous owner has already built them. They're already in place. as I mentioned, most of those finance packages that are used to facilitate these transactions require some lender finance. Here's what's important about that is that when an existing owner exits the business, they take with them an accumulated knowledge of the business, possibly key relationships with customers, perhaps some key knowledge about technology or some attributes of what makes the process, the business manufacturing process work, whatever. That owner has tremendous value acquired over their years of owning and running that business. A key part of the transition is knowing what those assets are and to try and figure out how to retain those assets inside the newly formed cooperative. Now, that may not be in the person of the owner, but has there been training on handing off those key relationships? Is there clarity around the critical operating strategies and metrics that are at work, so that as talent changes, that the key attributes, the key components of the business remain in hand. Next slide, please. So that's a summary of kind of the most common conversation that's going on around worker ownership these days. Certainly, there are a number of places where people can go for more information. On a national basis, I would particularly identify the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives and the Democracy at Work Institute. The Democracy at Work Institute is the nonprofit arm or the nonprofit partner of the Federation, and both are sources of expertise and knowledge and connection to other parts of the worker co-op community. In this region, I certainly would encourage folks in Nebraska to be contacting Charlotte and others with the Co-op Development Center at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, source of expertise on a number of cooperative topics and well-resourced and networked inside the larger co-op community to identify and respond to whatever kinds of needs or opportunities there are. If anybody is interested in a more expanded version of this, they can look on the CDS website. I've got the URL there. I presented a longer presentation that goes into some more details about those three approaches to worker ownership, and that's on our website. You're welcome to track that. I mentioned that there are accountants and lawyers that specialize in the cooperative business model. I personally don't know many of who those would be in Nebraska, but I'm pretty sure that Charlotte would have some knowledge and expertise there. So by all means. And then the last thing I would note is that finance for cooperatives is almost always done in partnership with a specialized finance organization. In this case, both Shared Capital Cooperative and the Local Enterprise Assistance Fund are two examples of community development investment financial institutions, CDFIs, that specialize in lending to cooperatives. Often they engage as well with other non-cooperative lenders, both to educate those other lenders about where the risks really are in cooperative lending and how to mitigate those, and in that whole process, attempting to bring capital into the transaction. So those are just some of the resources that are out there. And again, Dowie and the Federation would be another source of some expertise. Next one, please. So with that, I would be happy to make myself available to questions and conversation about any of these things I've just talked about or other aspects of worker ownership. And thank you for your kind attention.
All right, thank you so much, Kevin. That was a great presentation. I would also like to welcome Charlotte Nargis to the call. Charlotte works with the Nebraska Cooperative Development Center out of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Yeah, I just invite Charlotte if you have any questions or discussion.
Sure. Thank you, Justin. Thanks again to the Center for Rural Affairs for hosting these educational series. I think it's very beneficial to learn about the different sectors of how cooperatives can help. And so I really appreciate that the center has been doing this. And Kevin's mentioned the Nebraska Cooperative Development Center. We are here as a resource, but in Nebraska, we really haven't had any worker cooperatives formed, which is why we wanted Kevin to join us and and share a lot of the concept. And so when I'm thinking about this, you mentioned this, that many times people are very unfamiliar with this type of ownership. What have you found is the most helpful in people to be encouraged to explore the worker cooperative model?
Yeah. So particularly in rural communities, I think there is a broader base of knowledge and comfort with the cooperative model than we sometimes assume. So we know that dotted across the rural landscape of the Midwest, we have agricultural cooperatives that play a dominant role. Those are producer-owned cooperatives where the cooperative exists to serve the needs of agricultural producers, whether for inputs or for marketing. But that cooperative structure pretty much remains the same. You've got a different motivation for forming because you're looking at the employees being the owners, but everything else kind of fits into a pleasant mold. So once you start getting, I think being knowledgeable about or exposed to how cooperatives work in another sector that might be more locally familiar provides a good jumping off point for understanding how that model might work in other places. Clearly, I encourage folks when they are thinking about forming a cooperative to do what I call intellectual tire kicking. A more formal phrase might be pre-feasibility analysis. And what that means is go out on the web, go out and learn about and read, watch some of the articles or videos that are popping up these days that tell the story of how this model is being used in other places. There is a wealth of information that's being presented about worker ownership, and certainly it's something you can do in the evening in your easy chair, or whenever it's convenient. It's widely accessible. It never hurts to go and visit, to engage a conversation. I find that in the cooperative world generally, worker-owned, certainly no different, that cooperators appreciate and value cooperation, and that there is generous sharing, that if you were to contact a worker-owned co-op and say, can we set up a time, we're thinking about ... just want to pick your brain, or tell us about your experience. I find that so long as you do it at a time that's convenient, cooperators are very generous in sharing their time. So finding, kind of dig into the lived experience of others who have already walked that pathway. And then by all means, connect with a cooperative development specialist who has some expertise. I say that most folks will only ever be part of forming one cooperative in their life. As such, they are prone to all of the mistakes that we make anytime we do something for the first time. I sometimes draw the analogy to the first time as a late teen, and the first car that I owned, I tried to change the oil. I successfully drained the oil, took the oil plug out of the pan, drained the oil, went and assembled the rest of the stuff, put in the new filter, started putting in the new oil, and started hearing glug, 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 glug down at the bottom of the pan. It's like, Oh, forgot to put the plug back in. All right, that's number one. The second time I did it, I forgot to lubricate the gasket on the filter. Oops, number two. I got better after that. My point is this, that anytime we as human beings try doing something that's modestly complex, let alone that involves the livelihoods of others, that's a complicated activity. And we should guide ourselves not based on the path that we as rugged individualists would choose to take. Let's take an easier path and pick the brains of people who have seen multiple deals and who can advise on good, better, or best practices that might be applicable in a particular situation. So my biggest plug is align yourself with folks who know and understand the model and have seen and done more than one of them, because our knowledge base improves with more that we do. I think the last thing I would say is, by all means, take advantage of legal and accounting expertise, but a caution, and this is not a knock on either of those professions, but especially in places like employee ownership, where you are actually going to spend significant amounts of your day working in and deriving your income from this organization, and you're working with others, you want to be aligned with support professionals, co-op developers, if you will, that know something about human cooperation and all the various forms that sometimes pop up. And I don't necessarily, it's not every attorney or every CPA that, while they might know the law or IRS rules, putting that in the practice of, so how do human beings operate, is not necessarily an assumed outcome. So equipping, to have a group equip itself with the perspective of somebody who has helped folks form cooperative enterprises is another thing that I strongly encourage. So those are some examples, some things I'd offer.
Well, I thought that was a great highlight. I just thinking of the points that you made on really looking at examples that are worked in Nebraska. A group that we're working with now, forming quite a few, are our rural grocery stores. And another thing that I'd like to just emphasize, that I think a reason why you might want, even if it's not a cooperative developer person, but somebody external to the group, help facilitate some of the initial conversation, is that way it's not one person appearing to try to push an idea on, and allows for a lot more open conversation, I think, and sharing. So another reason you might want someone external that could help in facilitating to get that why and the motivation for doing that. I thought that you shared a lot of really excellent points there. Are you seeing more people in Minnesota or groups now wanting to do the worker cooperative conversion? Are you getting more calls?
We've had a few. Minnesota has perhaps a dozen worker-owned cooperatives. We've had a few larger ones in the past that have aged out or gone in different pathways. We are receiving more inquiries. Again, we're in that kind of time when folks are looking at, what do I do with my business? How do I, the business climate, the pandemic, the Great Recession before that, have all put a huge stress on rural communities and caused people to think about, so how much longer do I want to, carry this load? And so we are seeing more interest, not necessarily showing up as rapid conversions. We often suggest that, so I mentioned that a major way that this conversation comes up is when an owner of a business starts thinking about their retirement. We find that a particularly important time is to try and have this idea and information available 5 years before the owner actually wants to exit, so that there is time for them to move through that exploration process on their own, to pick their time of what makes sense for them, their finances, their families, etc. And so there can be a very long lead time between the time that a conversation first gets held and the time that actually some other activities, conversations with employees, formation of cooperatives, negotiations with lenders, etc. There can be a very long lead time. We also find that assistance often is done well when it is available in an anonymous way, that we find owners don't necessarily want the world to know that they're thinking about exiting their business. It changes the dynamics when that information is known. And so this thinking about a transition, that support needs to be present a long time before the action actually occurs. So I think we are still in that contemplation stage in some cases, though in others, the time is right now. The time was yesterday, and so we need to do it right now. That happens too, and I've seen both.
Kind of still on the education, but when when I really liked what you shared about the exploration stage and determining the right form and moving forward. It really shares, because the worker cooperative is not going to be the appropriate model for every business and
Agreed.
every group of individual, but it's continuing to educate that it's at least listed as an idea, that even if it is just listing out in the checklist of, that isn't what we have. We don't have the interest or the desire to move forward, because you really have to, if people are going to be workers, they need to be motivated to help move that business forward. They're no longer employees. They have to make the decisions on what's best for that business.
Yeah, it's like they need to be both. They need to both function with the perspective of ownership, as well as, perhaps a more privatized, what does this do for me in my role as an employee and a particular job role that I might have in the organization, and the ability to wear both hats mostly at the same time, or rapidly taking one off and putting the other on and switching back and forth in a conversation is actually an acquired skill. It's an acquired talent to be able to shift your frame of reference depending on what conversation is being held. So yeah, it's really important in that kind of assessment phase to kind of be thinking through where all this fits.
Justin, did you have any questions?
I don't think so. Thank you both so much. Charlotte, thanks for being here today. And Kevin, just thank you so much for joining us, for presenting. It's really great to have your expertise. I'd invite anybody who's watching this video, who's caught it on YouTube or social media, to leave comments below, questions below if you have any. And for further questions on cooperatives, please reach out to Charlotte at the Nebraska Cooperative Development Center and myself at the Center for Rural Affairs, and we'll see what we can do for you. So thank you all. Take care and have a great afternoon.